In this video, we're going to look at an argument for descriptive egoism, what we can call the wants argument. So let's see how that works. What is this argument? So, very straightforward. Premise 1 says you always do what you most want to do. Premise 2 says you always most want to do what you believe is in your self-interest. The conclusion is you always act selfishly. In other words, you always do what you believe is in your self-interest. You might be wrong about your self-interest, and so you might not always do what in fact is in your self-interest, but you're always trying to do what is in your self-interest. That's always your goal and your motivation. Okay, so is this a sound argument? Does it give us reason to believe the conclusion? Well, it is certainly valid. The question is whether or not it has true premises. So I'm going to suggest that, in fact, and following Rachel's, that while both of the premises seem plausible, in fact, they are not both true. Which one is false is going to depend upon how you use the word want. If you use it in one way, one premise is true. If you use it in the other way, the other premise is true. And so if the argument seems like a plausible argument to you, if it seems to you like both premises are true, I'd suggest that that's because you're using the word, you're interpreting the word want in different ways when you hear those two premises as true. So since the argument might seem to have some initial plausibility, what we're going to spend most of our time doing is actually criticizing the argument. So let's consider the feeling of obligation or the feeling of duty to keep a promise. We want to ask, does the word want apply to this motivation? You can have a motivation, you have this feeling that I should keep my promise, and then we want to show you're motivated, you have at least some motivation to keep your promise. Does the word want apply to this motivation? If we're using the word want so that it does apply to this motivation, then it's going to turn out that the second premise is false. If we're using the word want in a way that doesn't apply to this motivation, it's going to turn out that the first premise is false. So we're going to be focused on moral feelings of moral obligation and their motivation, and sort of thinking about, okay, how should we understand those, and how do the two premises, what do the two premises say about these moral feelings, these feelings of moral obligation? And we're going to see that the premises have trouble describing them. So let's suppose first that the feeling of duty is not a want. So you have this motivation to keep your promise, but we're going to say the word want doesn't apply to that. So if we're using the word want in that way, what do we mean? Well, what would be some examples of some wants? Lust, hunger, thirst, greed, the desire for sleep. What would be some non-wants? Respect for others or self-respect, a sense of duty, a sense of obligation, a sense of pride, and a sense of moral dread, of fear of doing the wrong thing. So those are all motivations, but when we talk about wants, and I want to do something, sometimes we mean things along of the first sort. So what distinguishes wants from other motivations then? When we're using the word want, we're using it to talk about a particular kind of motivation. What do we mean by want? Well, probably something like this. We want things that cause pleasure and stop pain, things that involve the body. So sleeping, sex, food, and then like greed is maybe greed for money, and that's not directly having to do with the body, but it probably has to do with desires. It's derivative, so we want things to happen with and to our body involving pleasure and not pain, and money is going to help us get those things. Not necessarily, but that's a straightforward form of greed. And so satisfaction of these wants involves sensory perception. So, for example, it involves taste sensations, the feeling of fullness in the body. But what about non-wants? What are they like? Well, so they're mostly involved with some sort of higher cognition. So thinking or reasoning or imagining. That's how we have probably a sense of duty, a sense of obligation, a sense of pride, a sense of moral dread. Those involve pretty sophisticated mental operations, thinking about what might happen if I do this, what might happen if I do that, how would other people feel, could everybody act in this way, what would it be like for the other person, and that all involves a lot of pretty high, sophisticated cognition. You know, other animals, lower animals, can have lust and thirst and hunger, but they probably can't have things like a sense of duty or moral dread, for example. And we use thinking and reasoning not only to sort of come up with these sense of obligation or duty, but then we use thinking and reasoning to tell, oh, I've succeeded in my goal. Whereas in the case of hunger or thirst, I know that I've succeeded by how my body feels. And the non-wants probably don't involve specific sensory pleasure or pain. So, when you're happy, when you feel like you've done a good job, there's probably some important stuff, sort of bodily sensations that are part of that, but there are no specific sort of particular ones that are particularly important to it. It's a much sort of broader and, in terms of your body, vaguer feeling. So probably there's no strict or sharp line between wants and non-wants, but we can summarize the distinction by talking about are we talking about something that is more focused on sensory perception and your body, or is it something that's more focused on thinking and reasoning and a more abstract and more sophisticated forms of mental activity? So maybe want refers only to the body and sensory pleasure and pain motivation. So when we say I don't want to keep my promise, what that means is I don't have those sorts of bodily involved sensory desires to keep my promise. That's what we mean when we say I don't want to keep my promise. But sometimes you act on feelings of obligation and duty and the like instead of on body-based wants. And so that means you in fact do lots of things you don't want to do, right? You have these more sophisticated motivations, and you sometimes act on them instead of your less sophisticated motivations. And so if we're interpreting want in this narrow way, where it has to do with your body and less sophisticated mental processes, then of course you frequently do things that you don't want to do. So that means that the first premise is false if we interpret want narrowly. The question then becomes, can we interpret want more broadly in a way that would make the first premise true? If we can't interpret want in a way that makes the first premise true, then the argument's not going to get off the ground. And so we want to know, can we interpret want more broadly to make the first premise true? Well, maybe, and that's what I'll get into in the next video.